I am a former pupil at George Watson's College, so I graduated in 2015 and I am currently working for Intercultural Youth Scotland as an anti-racist and pro-black educator. So I've been employed by George Watson's College to deliver a 15-week programme. So the White Privilege Walk is supposed to show that privilege, although people have it, it's not necessarily within your control, and I think that's what can be really difficult initially to reflect on is I have all of this privilege, I'm not in charge of any of it, but what do I do with that?
Black History Month at George Watson's College. Let's see what they've been doing. George Watson's College is a huge independent school in Edinburgh. I've chosen it just because they happen to have put a suitable video online. It also emphasises, as I've said before, to those parents who might think, oh, my children are safe from the indoctrination that goes on in state schools. They're in an independent school. I call that the independent school delusion. Don't think that for a moment. Most independent schools just go in the same direction. Often the head teacher, they don't really know what they think. They don't really care too much, but they know what the government thinks and they want to stay on the right side of the government so the government doesn't shut them down, basically. And so they often give free rein to activist teachers to promote their own political ideology in the classroom. So let's have a look at Black History Month at George Watson's College. Now we're going to have a look in a minute at a video they made about a white privilege walk. And as part of that video, it includes pupils preaching the tenets of critical race theory, white privilege, etc. And the particular pupils that I'm going to show, they're in S6, which means they're aged 17 or 18. So they can vote in Scottish elections. And you can look at it in two ways. You could either say the school is using them to promote a political ideology, or you could say the school is giving them a platform to present a political ideology. Whichever way, they're being treated like adults, presenting a viewpoint, so therefore I'll respond to them like adults as well. So think of anyone who says, oh, you shouldn't put school children in videos, etc. Well, say there's 17, 18-year-olds who are being treated like adults. They're being given the platform to promote a political opinion. So I will respond to it. Now, just to give you an idea about the idea of white privilege, this image might be quite helpful. This image is from the anti-racist Educator website in Scotland, which I've talked about before, quite influential within the Scottish educational establishment. You can see there, the implication is for straight white middle-aged men, everything's easy. I mean, I can relate to that. I mean, that's my experience of life, very definitely. I mean, if I were to apply for a job anywhere, they would just say, we really wanted someone like you. You're just the sort of person we wanted. For example, if I joined one of the other political parties and said, I'd like to be an MSP, they'd say, oh, thank goodness. A straight white middle-aged man. That's just what we've been looking for. You're front of the queue. You're just the sort of person we want. We've had too many black women applying recently. We need someone like you. I don't think so. If I applied for a job with the BBC, they'd have a look at my background, my views on things. If I applied for a job as a teacher, again, they'd be saying, oh, that's fantastic. We're really looking to fill our quota of people with socially conservative views. Because I say, for me, as a straight white middle-aged man, I mean, the world is my oyster. I don't think. But anyway, let's imagine instead we think about someone who's black. Because according to the sort of white privilege and the thinking you'll hear throughout this video, the impression given is, everything's against you in this horribly racist society. So you've got every reason to be full of resentment, maybe give up, to blame everyone else, and to take on a sort of neo-Marxist oppressor and oppressed mindset. Where actually it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, is there such a thing as racism in Scotland? Of course there is. To some degree, there'll be some racists. At my time teaching in England and in Scotland, it was very, very rare to come across what I thought was a real racist. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, you'd have two pupils saying the most horrible things they could think of to each other. And then as part of that, one of them might come out with something racist. Now, my attitude to that wasn't just all the other horrible things that were said. They didn't really matter. Let's just focus on the racist thing. I would tend to deal with that as, that's just people being as horrible as they can to each other. They shouldn't do that, and you deal with it. On a couple of occasions, I've come across pupils, I would say, who did genuinely hold hostile, unpleasant, racist views. But in both cases, it wasn't that they were otherwise you know, fine, upstanding pupils, but just had this blind spot in terms of racism. It wasn't that at all. In one case I can think of, it was a boy who was unpleasant to other pupils for a whole range of reasons. And another boy I can think of is a boy who had, you know, very difficult background in some ways. And again, his behaviour was very difficult in lots and lots of different ways. So it wasn't the sort of thing where, you know, Black History Month is going to do the trick, or a bit of anti-racist education is going to make the difference. The racism was a reflection of much deeper issues. But what they do with the white privilege, critical race theory ideology is they build an inverted pyramid of speculation. So starting from the genuine racism that people might experience, and you build on that a speculative framework that basically everyone's against you if you're not white. Everything and everyone is against you. You're surrounded by racism. I mean, the idea, as you or I might recommend, there's the ideal we're aiming for, is where people have just forgotten about race. You just don't think about it. I mean, don't you find that when you deal with people of another race? Okay, you obviously notice, but you get to know the person, you deal with them. Does it enter your head in your dealing with them normally after then? I find, no, you just get on with people the same as everyone else. But the critical race theorists would say, absolutely not. That's not what we want. No way. Race has got to be at the forefront of our thinking all the way, all the time. So let's have a look at the video here.
I think seeing from the activity we just did, like seeing how dramatically there's a divide in society, because like before I was aware of it, but from my exercise I didn't realise how far the gap was. But I think it's good that everyone took part in it and actually embraced it, so everyone can become more aware.
I obviously knew that I had privilege and like white privilege, but I think turning around and seeing my friends so far back was quite uncomfortable, like especially because the questions we were asked about things on a day-to-day, so like their day-to-day, seeing that they're like visually seeing their day-to-day experiences so different.
I was also quite uncomfortable by seeing that the black people in the group only stepped forward for 1 out of 30 of the questions. And seeing how far forward my other friends were was also uncomfortable, because I saw myself as, I guess, like further back and less than, which can be uncomfortable to confront.
Let's have a think about that then. So this white privilege walk activity, the way it seems to work is everyone starts off standing in a line, then you get asked questions, and according to your answer to the questions, you take steps forwards. And the idea is at the end of it, it illustrates that the white pupils have gone furthest, and let's say the black pupils have gone just a couple of steps. And it shows what a huge disadvantage black people are at in Britain or in Scotland. Now the problem there in the video, when the pupils were talking about it, they were taking it for granted, it seemed, that the outcome of that little illustrative game actually reflected reality. Now I would suggest to those pupils maybe haven't taken a step back and asked the critical question, does this little activity actually reflect reality? If it does, in what way does it reflect it? Now if you do an activity in schools like that, you get people walking around in the playground, it's quite easy for that to become a form of indoctrination, because young people often won't be able to tell the difference between what the game is showing and reality. They will just assume their focus will be on the outcome of the game or the illustration, and that will be taken as the fact, whether or not it reflects reality. So they're a bit suspicious of that. This idea of white privilege though, imagine, you know, a white boy in, say, you know, that's George Watson's college, let's say over the hill in Wester Hailes, you know, not so well off area, single mum, alcoholic, living in a sort of small flat in some sort of tower block, going to a school that's got an awful lot of problems in it. I mean, would any of those girls from George Watson's college like to explain to him that he's benefiting from white privilege? Would you like to put him in the game as well, to watch him surging ahead of that young black girl, very articulate, one would assume, probably from a wealthy family, been at an independent school? Would you like to explain to him about his white privilege? Sometimes think about that. Think about, let's say, for example, one of Barack Obama's daughters. I mean, do they suffer from lack of white privilege? I mean, they would have every opportunity, every door open to them in every possible way. And then in our society as well, we've got to look at the fact that in some cases, in a lot of cases, there is such a thing as black privilege as well. That's not some wild speculation. I mean, it's just fact. It's just fact. In a lot of contexts, there are special opportunities, quotas, grants, etc. for people of minority ethnicities. That's the way our society has been engineered increasingly. So in many contexts, I think people of minority ethnicities are deliberately put at an advantage. Now, in terms of this activity going on at George Watson's College, my teaching career has been in independent schools. What prejudice is most prevalent in independent schools? I would say overall, I came across prejudice or a bit of an unsavoury attitude, basically towards sort of poor people rather than other races. Because there'd be all sorts of races in the school, but there wouldn't be many people, obviously, who are not particularly well off. So that would be a prejudice that I find myself challenging from time to time, just inviting pupils to reconsider their attitudes, shall we say. But this is, I say, it's the race is the issue here. Now, people steeped in this ideology, they'd say, oh, that's quite right. Poverty is really important as well. That's why we need to take an intersectional approach, because that takes everything into account. It takes into account, sex, poverty, race, LGBT, I mean, you name it, the list goes on and on and on. You have to take all these things into account to work out how privileged or disadvantaged a person really is. And the idea is, on this ideology, that we've got to skew the system, we've got to rig every process so that every group, every section and subsection and crossover section and intersection, then every group's got to have exactly the same outcome on everything we can measure. That's the end point of it. I mean, what we'll maybe have, the direction we're going in years to come, there'll be like a checklist for university entrance, for job applications, for everything. So you've got to give all these details, and every organisation will need to assess how many people they need of each different combination of factors. Now, of course, if you take all these factors, it doesn't really leave any room for the factors that often actually really do make the difference to someone's life. So if what you knew about me was that I was a straight, white, able-bodied, cisgendered, married, middle-aged male, how well did you think you know me from that? How much would you know about me as a person? Would you feel you really knew what sort of person I was? No, not remotely, not remotely. Yet according to this ideology, if you know those things about something, you've really pinned that person down. You've pigeonholed them. You know where they stand. But on this ideology, meritocracy is dead. And they believe that it's the government's job to equalise outcomes between every group there. I mean, the choices, some people say, the choices between freedom and equity, you can't have both. If you're going to enforce equity, then the government needs to basically control everything, to be able to engineer everything to get the right results. So this white privilege walk, let's have a look at the questions now. So imagine one of these questions will be asked, and according to the answer, the person takes a step forward or doesn't. Remember, this game is supposed to illustrate life opportunities. So if you take a lot of steps forward, that's showing you've really been able to get on in life. If you've only taken a couple, that shows that you've really been pulled back and restricted, held back in your everything in your life. Basically, this has been a huge factor in where you've got to on your life path. So let's have a look at the questions, shall we? I assume these are the questions used. They seem pretty standard. There's 30 of them. I'm not going to go through all of them. I've just chosen a few. Let's see what you think about them. Here's the first one. People often assume I am an immigrant before I even say a word. Right, does that happen to me? No. Right, okay, so some people might think possibly someone's an immigrant. I mean, to be honest, there is just an element of probability here. If someone's of a minority race, the probability of them being an immigrant is much higher. So people might not assume, but they might suspect, they might think there's a higher probability. And if that person isn't an immigrant, then obviously someone in a previous generation must have been. So the fact that people do wonder that, is that really much of a problem? I don't really see that it is. Right, the next one gets more to the heart of the matter here. It says, the question, where are you from, is a hard one to answer, especially if the person asking is trying to figure out why I look the way I do. Right, I just disagree. Where are you from is not a difficult question to answer. Okay, people might mean different things from it, but you can answer however you like. You can add more information. And the fact that someone is curious and interested in you and your background is nothing to be offended by. It's not hostile at all. In fact, it's a sign of someone being interested in you. There was one time I was talking to a student who was at Edinburgh University in their first term. They looked Chinese to me. They didn't have an accent, but they looked Chinese. So I said to them, I was going to say, where are you from? But I thought, oh, you're not supposed to say that, are you? So I said, have you moved to Edinburgh to study? Okay, what could possibly be wrong with that? So whether you've moved from China or whether you've moved from Glasgow, I'm not asking that. I'm just saying, have you moved to Edinburgh to study? And the student responded in a sort of, no, I'm Scottish. As if they're quite offended. As if, you shouldn't have asked that. That was a bad thing to ask. Okay, where do you live? Dundee. Right. What? That's like looking for offence, making offence out of absolutely nothing. I mean, sometimes people will hear me speak and say, oh, you're not from Scotland, are you? I don't say, that's really offensive. How dare you say that? I mean, it's just normal. It's just taking an interest in people, working out, say, where people are from. That's quite an important aspect of understanding people, of getting to know people. Now, occasionally some people will use that in an unpleasant way, like I've been told by some SNP supporters to go back to England. Okay, that sort of thing happens. There are some people around who are not very nice. Okay, but that question's not talking about that. Wanting to know where someone's from, wanting to know about their background, their ancestry, their heritage, whatever, is a perfectly natural thing to ask and is a sign of interest in a person. But in these questions, they try and play it as a grievance and a sign that you're living in a racist society. Right, so when I walk into any British supermarket, I will rarely find plenty of food products that meet my family's traditions. Right. Now, remember, this white privilege questionnaire is about assessing someone's life chances. Do you get to be a doctor? How much money do you end up making, etc. These are the real key determinants of your progress in society. So what food you can find in the supermarket, whatever the answer is to this, it's not relevant to this white privilege walk idea. But going back to it, when I walk into any British supermarket, I think the clue is in the name there, market. Markets. The way a market works is if there's people wanting to buy something, generally someone will come in and step into the market and will sell it to them. That's how capitalism works, and you make money out of it. So if there's a sufficient number of people with a demand for a certain type of foodstuffs in an area, then someone will supply it. That's the way an open market works. And I know in many supermarkets there are sections of food for other cultures, other traditions, and there are specific shops catering for that. But what this has got to do with white privilege, again, I really do not know. Right, next one. It's hard to find the right hair products that work for my hair. Yeah, I can relate to that. But again, the idea that your life is basically in ruins. You've been held back really unjustly and unfairly on your whole career. The whole trajectory of your life has been undermined. And one of the points is it's hard to find the right hair products that work for my hair. Okay, next one. When I walk into a shop, the security guard is likely to keep a closer eye on me because of the colour of my skin. Right, first thing I would say to that is, how do you know? How do you know that? That's just planting the idea in people's minds that any security guard who just seems to keep an eye on you or wanders near to you, whatever, is probably racism. That's why. But in most cases, how will people know? The other would say, again with this, for example, let's say you're a security guard and you see there's been a lot of thefts by young people, and you see some young people and you think, I'll just keep an extra eye on them. You never know. I would say, fair enough. I wouldn't say that's youth discrimination. So if it was the case that in a shop that they'd had particular experience, that there'd been some people of whatever ethnic group who'd caused problems, including white, so it doesn't matter. So a certain type of person, if their experience is, they tend to be the people that there's been more problems associated with, then if they just keep an extra eye on them, I think that's quite understandable. If that would have happened to me, I wouldn't have any problem with that at all. Right, next one. Whenever there's a terrorist attack, people tend to look at me in a more fearful, hateful and or accusing way. Right, well, people shouldn't do that, obviously, should they? But on the other hand, I would say to people promoting this ideology, is that not exactly the same that you're doing to white people, though? You're saying white people are probably racist, lots of them are racist, that you're surrounded by racism. Whenever you're around white people, there's going to be racism there. Is that not just making exactly the same mistake? Projecting a negative stereotype or assumption or whatever onto a group of people? It seems the same mistake to me. Right, the books I read at school rarely have characters that share my skin colour, that share the same skin colour as me. Well, okay, well, that's part of what it is to be a minority in a country. If you're going to be black, if you're black in Scotland, then you're in a minority. But as far as I'm concerned, I hope that's not a big deal particularly. Everyone's the same. We're just people. I don't want to focus on race. Now, if a black person objects to that, if they say, I hate being a minority, I don't want to be surrounded by white people, well, ultimately, if anyone's going to take responsibilities for that, it's the person who chose at whatever stage, if it was you or a generation before, someone at some point made the decision to come and live in a nation where they were going to be in a racial minority. Now, I'm not criticising that decision, fine. But I'm just saying if there is going to be any complaint about that, I suppose that's where the complaint needs to be directed. I mean, books in school these days, they include characters of all races. To be honest, they're quite obsessive about it, I would say even. But the fact is, if you're in a minority, your representation is going to be in a minority as well. So I don't really see much to complain about that. Right, in the movies I watch, the characters who share the same skin colour as me are rarely the heroes. Okay, now in films I watch, the general pattern in films from the last 10 years or so in particular is that generally minority ethnic characters are often perfect. They're all-knowing, they're all-wise, they're morally perfect, and their role in the film often is to be a contrast with the bad white people who are the opposite of those things. So time and time again, I find films are set up to show black minority ethnic people in a good light in contrast to white people. Okay, which I find quite wearing. I don't mind it. I don't mind for that to happen as part of a story or whatever. That's absolutely fine. What I'm not so happy with is it being deliberate policy, that you do that time and time and time and time and time again. So, in terms of a complaint here, I'm not really sure there is one. Right, in the history I've studied, my ancestors are not given much attention or credit. Right, okay, are my ancestors given much attention or credit? Only in the sort of most general sense, in the history we'd learn would be about my nation. But when I learn history about, I don't know, Robert the Bruce or something, I don't think, right, if you trace my family tree back far enough, you'd get to those people who were there. You probably wouldn't. I don't know. I just don't think about history like that when I'm learning history. But again, ultimately, if you're in a nation, you're going to learn the history of that nation. Now, if your family at whatever stage has decided to come to that nation, I would say it's your nation. So you're learning the history of your nation. The fact that you might not have a genetic link to them, okay, you might wish you did. You might think you don't relate to the history in the same way that people who might have a genetic link to it. Okay, that might be true. But no one can do anything about that. And if you're going to blame anyone, blame the person at some point who decided to come and live here. I would say don't blame them. But you don't need to blame them. You shouldn't blame them because they haven't done anything wrong. But if you are going to try and pin the blame somewhere, that's where it needs to be. This can't be solved by saying, right, in Scotland, we're not going to learn Scottish history anymore. We're going to learn whole world history because then everyone's going to be treated equally. No, an important part of nationhood is national identity, national solidarity, a sense of unity, and a sense of commitment to the nation. Part of the way that is imbued in young people is through teaching history to them. So teaching the history of, for example, of Scotland and the UK, that's part of the process of making people identify with and commit to have loyalty to, which is a very positive thing, to their nation. Right, next question in the white privilege walk. The only adults in schools who share the same colour as me are the cleaning and or catering staff. Okay, is there anything wrong with being a cleaning or member of the catering staff? I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. So the basic issue is saying there's no black or whatever teachers. Okay, that might be the case in some schools, probably less, probably I imagine almost all schools in Scotland would have a minority ethnic teacher, certainly high schools. But so what? It doesn't matter. I don't divide the world into different types of people. So you say, well, if you're a black person, or you've got a white teacher, oh, that's a big problem. That's a whole different sort of person. How can you possibly relate to a white teacher? Because that's a totally different class of person. I just don't see that like that. Let's just forget about the race. It's your teacher. Get to know them, and the teacher will get to know the pupils, and they'll work together, and everything could be fine. Now, if say a black student was thinking, oh, there's not enough black teachers in school, I would say, well, go and be one then. Go and be one. That's fine. Right, people online or in public have directed racist slurs at me. Okay, that's very bad. That shouldn't happen at all. But that's one type of offensive comment, and there's lots of other types as well. I mean, I've had more than my fair share of abuse hurled at me for various reasons, including sometimes for being from England. So yeah, that's very bad. But I don't think it's uniquely a race issue. It's a broader issue as well. It's difficult for me to find many spaces where I can be in the company of people who share the same colour as me. So that seems like a desire for segregation. We want, for example, a black common room at school. So if we have a black common room, all the black kids can go there, and then we can be together with people of our same race. That's what we want. To say it's called segregation. But again, the suggestion here is that it's quite normal. You probably should want to sometimes be with people of your own race. Now, is that really helpful in terms of integration and getting on with your life in Scotland? Is that a good message? I'm not sure it's very helpful at all. Right, when I am told about national heritage, about human history, or about civilization, I'm shown people who do not share the same culture and skin colour as me. Well, correct. So if you're talking about national heritage, of course not, because there were virtually no minority ethnic people in Scotland until a number of decades ago. Human history, civilization, in general, we're part of Western civilization, which was built up, well, basically fundamentally by sort of white Christian men would be the main influence there. So that is the civilization that we're part of. There are other civilizations in the world as well. I'm sure they're covered. But if we're learning about our own civilization, the fact is it is a civilization that was more or less built up by white people. Again, I'm not saying that in any sort of sense of pride or anything, but it's just the fact. And if people of other races have chosen to come and live within that civilization, then you need to learn about it. That's part of what integration is, isn't it? If you want to go and live in a different culture, then part of what you need to do, you don't need to abandon your own culture, but part of what you need to do is to learn about and value the civilization of which you are a part. Okay, next one. If ever I swear or behave badly, people tend to attribute these behaviours to the bad morals and or poverty of people who share my skin colour and cultural background. Again, I ask the question, how do you know? How do you know? Okay, and let's say you did believe there was a stereotype. Let's say you think people in society tend to believe that, for example, black people swear a lot and behave badly. Okay, I mean, another attitude could be, instead of complaining about that alleged stereotype, another attitude could be, well, I'm going to make sure I change that. I'm not going to do those things. I'm going to try and show people that I'm different than that. That would be a much more positive approach, wouldn't it? But it's always inviting the grievance and the resentment. Right, next one. Wherever I do well in a challenging situation, people may call me a credit to my race. Now, this is a bit ironic, isn't it? Because people who hold to this ideology, that's exactly what they demand. They want special treatment, special awards, special recognition for people of minority groups. That's a big part of their ideology. And yet when it's actually given, well, that's racism as well. Right, next one. I'm often asked to speak for all the people of my racial, cultural and or religious group. Right, imagine that's a lesson. Let's say the lessons about Hinduism, say. And let's say the teacher knows that one of the pupils is from India and thinks they're probably a Hindu. So they'll say to them, is this something? You can tell us anything about that. Do you know anything about this? Now, to my mind, traditionally, you'd think that's a really good moment in the lesson, isn't it? That's bringing someone's experience in. That's valuing the diversity in the classroom, inviting them to have a voice and to share their experiences with the rest of the class. But oh, no. That's racism, to ask people to say something like that. I would say it just sounds like good teaching to me. But again, these sort of critical race theorists, they're also the same people who say, black people need to be given a voice. We don't have a voice. We need spokespeople. You need to listen to us. Then if someone says, okay, you're black, can I hear your perspective? Then that's racism as well. As I say, everything's racist, basically, on this ideology. Right, next one. Whenever I speak to the person in charge, I can be sure that I will be facing someone who does not have the same skin colour as me. Right, no one can say that in Scotland. No one can say it. You cannot be certain in some context, if you don't know who the person in charge is, you cannot be certain that they're going to be of a different race. There might be a person of the same race. But again, it's taking probability. I think Scotland's like something like 96% white. So it's taking probability and turning it into a grievance. In other words, it's like saying the person in charge is probably white, therefore that makes you feel bad, it's holding you back, that they've got white privilege, you're disadvantaged, you've got a real grievance and resentment, and you would have achieved far more in your life if it hadn't been for the fact of your race. That's the thinking that is behind this. Right, next one. It's difficult for me to ignore and or minimise the impact of racism on my life. Okay, let's have a think about that. Ignore and minimise the impact. One of the reasons it might be difficult to ignore or minimise the impact of racism on your life is now you've got people going into schools with this sort of message that is amplifying, focusing on the alleged impact of racism. And as we've seen, a lot of the things they're describing as impact of racism, there actually isn't any evidence for any racism in them. They're just based on the probability, just the fact of being a minority is being presented as evidence that you're a victim of some sort of racist disadvantage. So is it difficult to ignore it? Right. If there are actual incidents, things going on, I'm sure particularly in a school, you'd find the school would be very swift in dealing with that. Similarly, if you go to the police, they'd be very swift in dealing with that. But the whole point of this questionnaire is to not minimise the impact of racism. It's to speculate and magnify and amplify any potential or imagined impact of racism. Right, next one. I go home from most meetings of organisations and or clubs that I attend feeling somewhat isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, feared or hated, rather than tied in and welcome. Right, really. So if you go to whatever organisation, whatever, any sort of sports thing or club or religious organisation or whatever, musical group of school, who knows, I end up feeling somewhat isolated and out of place. Now, if we're talking about teenagers, how many feel a bit isolated and out of place in probably most contexts that they find themselves? A fair few. Now, here's the key one, outnumbered. In other words, the message is, if you're one of the 4% of a minority ethnicity, did you feel outnumbered? Yeah, I did actually. I felt outnumbered. But do you need to think like that? Do you need to think, right, that was 10 against 1? Or do you need to think, there was 11 of us there? We're all in the canoeing club and we talked about where we're going to go canoeing on the canal next week. Would that not be healthier? Right, unheard, feared or hated. Again, it's feeling feared or hated. Rather than anything's happened, nothing's happened, no evidence needed. You just need to feel it rather than tied in or welcome. Again, it's inviting pupils to speculate and imagine the worst of the white people around them. Extremely unhelpful. Right, if my day or my week is going badly, I can't help but wonder if the negative episodes or situations had racial overtones. Right. Again, invitation to speculate to the worst possible motive. trend that happens. So if you have some sort of falling out with someone on the bus or something, they get in your way or tread on your toe or whatever, then you can wonder afterwards, was that because they were racist? Let's say when that happens to anyone else, because these things happen to everyone. So if you don't think, oh, that because of race, then maybe you'd think of another factor, wouldn't you? Maybe you start thinking, well, maybe I'm not a very likable person, or why does this always happen to me, or whatever. But again, it's not based in any fact. It's all based on speculation. So we've had a look at the questions there, and you can see what they're intended to do. They're intended to breed resentment, foster victimhood, and play on the insecurities of teenagers in this case. Now, might there be some people with a bit of a prejudice against people of other ethnicities? Very possibly, very possibly. There are lots of prejudices, though, that people tend to have. For example, height. People who are taller tend to be more successful in life overall. And in any other things being equal, people who are taller tend to get treated better. It's just the way it is. There's also substantial evidence of prejudice against ginger-haired people. Again, all other things being equal, there's just people can, to a small degree, just have a little bit of hostility towards ginger-haired people. There's lots of other things as well that result in some sort of prejudice towards people. But in terms of life outcomes, what really makes the difference? Is it all about race, which is the impression given by the white privilege walk? Where you get to depends on your race. Well, the biggest factors, well, some of the biggest factors that determine how people's lives turn out, IQ is a huge one. Family relationships, in terms of stable family, loving parents, that's a huge determinant of future prospects. I mean, if they wanted to do a two-parent privilege week at George Watson's College, that might be quite a helpful lesson in terms of making their own decisions going forward, but that will never happen with us. Someone's character, hugely influential. I mean, are you a hard worker, or are you a bit lazy? I mean, that's a huge determinant for future outcomes in life, obviously. And another huge factor is luck. Someone might say start a business and happens to go great guns, but maybe someone else, if they started that business 2 years later or 2 years earlier, it wouldn't have worked. So, luck plays a part. I mean, appearance plays a part. People are very attractive, tend to do better in various contexts. And then there's various other talents as well. People are just good at things or not so good at things. That makes a big difference to people's life path. So just to conclude here, so the ideology of critical race theory and this white privilege is that government actions needed to skew everything and basically to rig everything in favour of black and minority ethnic people. And the problem with that is it produces resentment in white people. It also produces resentment between races as well. For example, on most things you can measure, people of Chinese ethnicity tend to outperform white people. And so, minority ethnic, it includes some who, as I say, do particularly well. But what happens once you try and produce systems to flatten out all of these inequalities, it just produces injustice. Because society is not made up of these fundamental groups, it's made up of individuals. So when it comes to applying for a job, if they say, we're not giving it to you because you've got a bit too much white privilege, we're giving it to this person because they're of such and such a race, that produces injustices at the individual level. And that's just not right. So it's a damaging message, and it's also indoctrination. This is a controversial political viewpoint being presented to pupils as fact. Not as an ideology to compare to others, to discuss, to write essays about. It's been presented by an activist as fact. And this indoctrination is going on all over Scotland, completely unopposed by the Conservative Party as usual. And it is government policy. Right, you can see a couple more videos on this sort of topic here. And thanks for watching.